So now we're going to talk about part 2 of the Zippy Microservice structure and functionality in our QuoteServices app case study. And here we're going to talk about the structure and functionality of the ZippyQuoteRepository and how it applies the Jakarta persistence API to do its thing. We're also going to start by giving an overview of the Spring Data API, which if you haven't played around with this before, it's extremely powerful and can simplify many common queries with Spring. So to start with, historically, programmers have written SQL queries manually in order to access their data. But as you can imagine, handwriting SQL queries in Java code or JavaScript code or Python code or whatever is very tedious and error prone. So we'd like to find some way to automate it as much as we possibly can. Fortunately, Spring has this thing called the JPA Data API, which is a framework that simplifies the development of data access layers in Spring-based applications. In particular, what developers do is they write repository interfaces that contain methods done in very interesting and canonical ways to define access to their data. And the way this works is there's this data API that programmers can use to generate SQL queries automatically based on a method naming convention. And what you do is you use keywords like we see here in this highlighted part of this snapshot from some documentation, which talks about the keywords like starting with, ending with, containing, order by, not like, in, ignore case, and so on and so forth. And this gives you a way to write code that accesses various columns in the SQL tables that are corresponding to whatever you're doing here in an object relational mapping context. And what Spring does under the hood is it automatically creates methods that perform the corresponding SQL queries. And this column here in this screenshot shows what these various keywords generate in terms of SQL queries. And there's a whole slew of them. There's probably a dozen or more different keywords with corresponding SQL that can be automatically synthesized by Spring using the data API. So it makes life a lot easier. In particular, using the data API reduces the boilerplate code you would otherwise have to write when implementing persistence and data access layers in Java apps. So this is sort of a low code like mechanism to be able to access data using SQL queries without writing the queries themselves. So given that as background, let's now take a look at the quote repository that we're going to implement. And we're going to make this thing that's called the Zippy Quote Repository. And this is the JPA-based repository that will contain a database of quote objects containing Zippy quotes. And this diagram gives you a sense of the different pieces that are involved here. We have a Zippy Quote Repository, which, as you can see, essentially implements the JPA repository interface. And that, in turn, is going to extend the list CRUD repository, which in turn is going to extend the CRUD repository. So there's a whole slew of methods that come along for free when using JPA. And we're just going to have to define things we need in order to do the Zippy specific pieces. So you can see it gets all these reusable data access methods out of the box from the list CRUD repository interface and the CRUD repository, where CRUD again stands for create, read, update, and delete. And we'll take a look at some of these methods later when we get into the details. Here's what the actual class definition looks like. We say Zippy Quote Repository, which exists at the link shown below. This is annotated with the @repository annotation that indicates that the Zippy Quote Repository class provides mechanisms for a whole slew of different storage, retrieval, search, update, and delete, or CRUD operations on objects. And by extending the JPA repository, it gets all these other operations for free: save, find all, find by ID, find all by ID, etc. And this enables interactions with a database without having to write any SQL by hand, if you can do a few other little tricks we're going to talk about. For this particular instantiation of the JPA repository, the quote parameter, the first parameter that's provided here, is the entity type in the repository, and it's the type that the repository manages. And you can see that's the quote class with the integer and string as fields or columns. And then the second parameter, integer, is the type of the primary key of the entity, which in this case is its ID, which is an integer, as you can see up there. Now, here's where we start having some fun. We're going to define something called find by quote containing ignore case. And this is an SQL query that will be automatically generated by the Spring Data API to select the rows in the database that contain the query parameter. So if there's a query, you give a query as a string, and it'll find anything in the database that matches that query, ignoring case. So it's case insensitive. And we get that basically by using some of these keywords like ignore case and containing. So find means search or do select. By quote is the particular column we're referring to in the quotes or the quote entity. And then containing says look for something that matches, ignoring the case in a case insensitive way. And that's actually in part 3 of the lesson we're going to take a look at here shortly. And we're going to show, in part 4 of this lesson, we're going to show how to use this method that's automatically generated by Spring. Here's a simple example of what this does. So if you happen to search for the query Yao, then it will find all the rows in the database that match containing that word Yao, ignoring case. And the actual SQL query that's generated from this is select anything from the quote table where lowercasing each of the quote fields matches the query. And you can see here, it doesn't have to be an exact match. It can match a subset of the query again, in lowercase. So mercifully, we don't have to know how to write SQL like this. We just have to know how to use the Spring Data API. By the way, I used ChatGPT to generate the corresponding SQL that matches what the Data API keywords indicate. And that's a nice way to know what's actually going on under the hood. There's also another interface that the ZippyQuoteRepository extends, and this is called multi-query repository. And it defines a method that we'll take a look at in part 3 of this lesson that returns a list of quote objects that match all the queries in a list of string objects, whereas the one here just matched anything. So this is matched any, it's kind of an or, whereas this matches all. It's kind of like an and. And we'll see how that works when we get to the next part of the lesson. So that's the end of part 2.